When a film moves on from a film festival, it moves on to cinemas. When an XR piece moves out, where is it going? There's no equivalent to the XR cinema.
Today we are going deep on what it actually takes to make cultural XR experiences survive beyond their premieres. I'm here with Mike Golembewski, interactive designer, researcher, and writer running MWG Design Research. Mike has developed work across XR, interaction design, and creative technology for cultural, academic, industrial, and experimental context. We start by understanding why putting a festival premiered XR piece on a platform store is almost a guaranteed fail.
And the problem that you get with the platform stores is at the moment, there's really not any audience or market or infrastructure that's gearing towards these cultural works. It's a little bit like trying to bring a very nuanced cultural argument to a wrestling match.
What is the key to success for cultural XR projects?
The ones that I've seen that have worked well in the cultural sense, they all have one thing in common.
We look at what creators can do from day one to design for longevity, starting with a question most teams never ask themselves early enough.
Rather than thinking about the completion of the work itself, you have to think about how are you going to be moving it around after that for at least a year out.
And of course, we look at real examples of a cultural XR projects and what made it work when almost everything else disappeared.
The one that I would say has done the best job that I've seen, they did a project called In Pursuit of Repetitive Beats. Now, this was released years ago in the festival audiences, and it's been touring ever since. It's managed to hit the sweet spot, I think, of being a topic that people like and something that can move from market to market very easily.
But before we get into it, I wanted to remind you that if you don't have the time to watch the full interview and want to learn from other founders and creatives at the intersection between XR and AI, you should definitely check out the XR AI Spotlight newsletter. By subscribing, you will get weekly interviews like this directly in your inbox and access to a list of tools and apps that allow you to experience Gaussian splatting in VR, on Quest, and Vision Pro. Just check the first link in the show description. And now it's time to roll the title and welcome Mike under the spotlight. Michael, it is a real pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with one question on definition, right? What do you define as cultural XR?
It's a good question. And it's an interesting one because when I think about these things, I tend not to think about a hard definition. I tend to think about a working definition. Not true for everything, but it's true in the context of a discussion. And when you're talking about extended reality, immersive technologies, you have a lot of buzzwords in that audience. So for me, I like to almost categorize sometimes because I like to think about how artists connect with audiences, with their end users. I like to think about that end user. So cultural XR, when I'm talking about it here, I'm talking about the sorts of XR that works in a similar way to an artwork, in a similar way to a piece of theater, a piece of music, where its value is kind of as a piece of cultural and personal expression. You can separate this from kind of practical XR, which would be tools to help you do something, from gaming-based XR, which is still a form of cultural production, but it's got its very unique world that critiques and deals with this sort of outputs. And then you've got, I suppose, like cinematic VR, you have documentaries and films. There's a lot of bleed over you can imagine between these categories. But for me, the cultural XR...
Yeah, and absolutely. I don't think I don't mean to put things in a box, but I think it's kind of like just high level, right? There is, as you mentioned, a lot of bleeding. It's a good definition when things are not all black and white.
But they're like boxes that you move stuff around the house. Stuff jumps from one into the other when it's convenient. They're not permanent boxes.
Fair. So. Yeah. And one of the things that struck me, and actually people can check out this article that I've stumbled upon online to read it fully because I think it touches certainly on many of the things we're going to discuss today, is this concept that these cultural XR experiences tend to be short-lived. They live in a festival, they live at let's say an exposition, or at least that's how I often perceive them. And my thought is like, how should creators think about their work differently if they want this type of cultural XR experiences to live beyond a premiere or a festival? How can they think differently about making them?
It's a very good question. I mean, and it's interesting because when you're thinking about XR festivals, for the most of them, the festivals that deal with this cultural XR, with the XR positioning itself as a piece of artwork, I'm thinking about works like Notes on Blindness, works with the cultural relevance, they tend to sit in this almost film festival-like atmosphere. An XR festival is very similar to a film festival. Now, when a film moves on from a film festival, it moves on to cinemas, into environments that are very similar to a film festival in most respects, except a little bit less fancy. When an XR piece moves out, where is it going? Because all of a sudden you have a setup where there's no equivalent to the XR cinema where these films move on to. So when you make a piece of work that's going to be in this festival context, which is really important, this is where work develops, it's where it matures, it's where these communities making this cultural work emerge. But when it's done with the festival, these works are expensive to make, it needs to move on somewhere. So I think that when XR creators are thinking about their work, they need to think both in terms of the festival as a premiere, but also in terms of where's that premiere moving on after the premiere. Because is it moving on in some other category? What's the mechanism that it needs to keep making audiences after that initial viewing?
And so what is happening right now? I mean, based on your experience, based on your research, after these things appear at the Biennale or other, like what happens to them?
There's a different story for every work. Different works have different contexts. A lot of the work really does a lot of pushes to start moving on in a lot of different ways. The classic trend of it was that after the premiere, creative works would move on to the gaming platforms, like especially headset-based works, XR, VR. We're talking about things like the Meta Quest, works that are made on the Pico headset, works that are made on the Vive. There's sort of an illusion that once your work's done, you put it onto these platforms and then it picks up like a piece of gaming software, like something else would. That's a problem because it's a little bit like trying to bring a very nuanced cultural argument to a wrestling match. The audience doesn't meet the audience doesn't meet the expectations of the needs, and it's nothing wrong with a wrestling match or with cultural works. It's just that in order to distribute it properly, it has to be in a place that's kind of geared towards that. And the problem that you get with the platform stores is at the moment, there's really not any audience or market or infrastructure that's gearing towards these cultural works. And we can go into a little bit more detail across those later on. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the why that fails, I mean, of course, the audience is different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the audience that for which something that cultural experience is made is not necessarily the audience in terms of demographic, age, and interest. And so why it is kind of like critical, let's say this value, this recognition, right, that is done by these critics, let's say, fail by a big margin. I mean, we are not saying that this should become, I think in my impression, right, we don't expect this to become mainstream titles, right? That is not probably what anybody expects.
If it was film, it'd be the equivalent of a well-respected independent documentary, not the kind of works that you're creating or expecting to make you millions on the recoup for it, but works that are supposed to be self-sustaining, so they can at the very least pay for themselves in some way, and
but
talking
this
to
is
an audience.
instead is completely far, I mean, to the point that completely die in a way that nobody knows where they are. This is what I'm talking about, the gap.
And it's interesting because you mentioned it's a different audience, different demographic. Part of that is true, but even in the research I've done across these platforms, even when you have a very sympathetic audience member, they'll give it 5 stars and start explaining to other people on the platform, oh no, I know it only runs for 20 minutes. It's not really a game, but it's great. Because the people on the platforms, it's not even the lack of engagement. It's the platforms are tuned for things like repeat uses, for duration. All the metrics that you look at when you're saying, am I going to spend €30 on this game? These are how long is it in terms of replayability? 10 hours, so. 50 hours, excellent. When you come to cultural XR, particularly because it's been made for this festival environment, you're looking at 20 minutes as a sweet spot. for a festival piece. 20 to 40 minutes, anything past that, your audience starts getting uncomfortable in the piece. Your flow of people through the festival starts to get bogged down. So there's this kind of intersection that doesn't quite happen between these stores and the festivals. Duration is a part of it. Replayability is a part of it. One thing that's interesting with it is when you have a festival audience, you're looking at an audience that a lot of them are very new to VR. They might be very old to media, but they're very new to the interaction. So your interactivity when you design for this audience is you're designing for the new user who's put on a headset maybe 4 or 5 times before in their life. Um, Interesting as well, because that's also who you pitch to a lot of times when you're looking at funding applications. You have to make sure that the people that are paying for it are able to use it.
So you threw in a lot of things now there, and that's all things that I think are very relevant. So one is, for example, that for who you design, right? In the sense,
Yeah,
the experience, that's an important thing. The fact that then what's the price point when it reaches the store, whatever store that might be,
yeah.
as well as the funding venues that, let's say, are used to start this project, right? And to get them out the door. So I would like to start with that, maybe high level. So what are the business models driving these initiatives, at least from the beginning, when in the making, when there is a creative producer, maybe and a studio that is trying to build this cultural experience? How does that look at the very beginning?
I think it's different from project to project. The ones that I've seen that have worked well in the cultural sense, they all have one thing in common, right? They all started out before funding arrived. As this is something great to make, let's figure out how we can fund it. Not let's look at what funding's out there and see how we can tick those boxes. So so because of that origin story, right, of the projects that do well in this space, because it's hard to work in it, they're all a labor of love in some way or another. Um, and that's interesting because it sounds like it's some sort of judgment on the creation ethics. It's not. What it is saying, though, is that the start of every XR project is different because it's patched together. Let's get a little prototype together. Let's get some sketches. Let's get a script together. As this starts to build itself up, that initial funding sweep ends up being differently. Like historically, there's been projects I've worked on where the funding comes from cultural initiatives, like from the government. I've from various governments. You have the traditional models like you get with film production, where you might have, okay, we're going to get funding from such and such a country's film fund. The catch is that 20% of your budget needs to be spent in that country. You have these sorts of arrangements, and you also have industry funding. That's the sort that says, oh yeah, we like what you do, put it on our hardware, and we'll kick in a little bit. We'll kick in technical support, hardware support, and funding. So you tend to, at the start of the project, have these little hodgepodge of funding pots that eventually end up building to a certain stage where you say, right, we've gathered enough to kick off production properly. But the funding comes generally from kind of a longitudinal field of sources rather than one big source, at least in my experience, you know?
And that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
I mean, so let's say there is a good idea, solid. People said, okay, how do we get it funded, right? That's as
yeah.
things start. At that point, how can the team start thinking, let's say, to build something that has more, let's say, long-lasting value for
Yeah,
the audience? Are there some things that they could start from the very early design phase to building the experience?
absolutely. I mean, one thing about it is knowing what your end context is going to be is super important. For a bunch of reasons. Like, a lot of the work now has been talking about moving into location-based experiences, these sort of things, the idea of touring shows. Right from the start of your experience, knowing that end result gives you a lot of information that's important to your end audience review. Like if you're doing something for that has an educational arm to it, and you're thinking after the festival premiere, you might want it to go out touring to high schools, say to cultural centers, you want to be looking at the least expensive hardware that'll do the job for you because these institutions don't tend to have a lot of money. If you're looking at bigger cultural institutions, museums, you might consider hardware that would be prohibitively expensive for any kind of mass release, but that might give you better performance. So what this end output is starts framing very fundamental technical questions. Do I want to use the Apple Vision Pro? Or do I want to make sure it'll run even on the Quest 2, which is very long in the tooth as a hardware, so that places without a lot of resources can use it? That's one side. But an even bigger thing for that I think that creators could do very well thinking about at the start of the projects is, rather than thinking about the completion of the work itself, we finished it, we've got the gold master. That's not the end of the project. Um, you have to think about, how are you going to be moving it around after that for at least a year out? How are you going to be showing it in festivals? One bit that I've very seldom seen when I've worked with creative studios on this is budgeting for the maintenance of the project after the release is very important. Um, as you know, XR sits on a very volatile software hardware stack. Software changes fast, and hardware SDKs change even faster. So if you want to keep your project even able to be deployed, um, because one thing about a lot of this hardware is that your distribution mechanisms are centralized effectively. When you put something out on the Quest, it's either go to the command line and start doing it native in Android, which tech support can do, but most people can't, or deal with Meta's kind of distribution platforms. Um, so when you're dealing with this all of a sudden becomes very important when you're thinking about what your end audience is, and you need to keep your project updated to make sure it stays compliant with these platforms in your distribution model. Otherwise, you end up a year out from a project having to have somebody redo it at the last minute so that you can deploy it in a new venue because the underlying systems have changed. Yeah.
So if you instead look at, are there some examples of teams or experiences that have kind of like found their own way of extending the lifetime beyond just technicalities, right? That is important, right? I mean,
Yeah.
let's not get me wrong. Uh, but when you think about the strategy of keeping it alive, let's say bringing it around as you
Yeah.
described in some way, what are some examples that you think are successful?
If I want to look at the one that I would say has done the best job that I've seen is, I look at Darren Emerson and East City Films. They did a project that's an immersive project, but a location-based experience as well, called In Pursuit of Repetitive Beats. What the piece is about, it's about rave culture in the early 90s in the UK, and it basically mirrors the waiting for the phone call, finding out where the venue is, the dancing, and it's basically a documentary on this interesting chunk of cultural history. Now this was released years ago in the festival audiences, and it's been touring ever since. Um, it's managed to hit the sweet spot, I think, of being a topic that people like. They've got a stage build because it does have a physical set, etc., but that's been streamlined as streamlined as it can get. Ready-made venues waiting for this experience, and something that can move from market to market very easily. So it's the kind of thing that can be picked up. It's also short enough that it's comfortable experience. You get good user flow through it. So the nature of the experience is very well suited to LBEs. Conceptually, a rave is a sort of LBE, so it's almost talking about itself in a way. Yeah, and it's got that thematic link to it, but it's very well put together.
So I think that it feels like, that is more like something that might, from the very beginning, you can think that you can sell even for a long time, and then you start premiere it for a specific occasion, not instead like, we got something, then okay, but now how do we sell it? So it's more like on the long run, try to
Yeah,
pick and find what is a potentially cultural project that could also have some relevance on time, and that you can indeed easily, let's say, um, pitch around and
yeah.
repurpose in some way.
Yeah. And one of the challenges about working in immersive media is, it's unfortunate because the tool set is so new and constantly evolving, it's expensive to make. So these questions of longevity become necessary for the studios making it, because it's the only thing that justifies making a new work in expensive media. Um,
So
Yeah.
You mentioned several times regarding the length of this experience, right? Oh, yeah, it's
Mm.
short. And that is also one of the reasons you also brought up at the very beginning, where someone, oh, this is a 20 minutes
Yeah.
experience on the store, that may be leaving a negative review in a way, right? Now, what are some design decisions that can make those, let's say, short experiences feel more valuable to what is a broader audience that people might have, let's say, on the Meta store, for example, or on a Steam store?
Yeah. To make them more valuable on the platform side of things.
Yeah,
Um,
correct.
yeah.
Since they are so short, right? Like 20
Yeah.
minutes experience is kind of like dismissed. Maybe not a lot of replayability, dismissed. So you are
Yeah.
basically bound to fail in a way on a store.
Yeah. I mean, one thing about these pieces that's interesting that could be an avenue for the store use that could work well is if you're planning an alternate form of distribution. If you're thinking about either event-based, location-based, so attaching it to existing festivals, working with museums, doing kind of standalone location-based experiences, working with public venues, the idea of using the storefront as almost the equivalent of where you put your trailer rather than the full work is something interesting, a way that people can test it before going to the event or booking it for a more kind of bespoke interpretation could be good. It's a very difficult act though to balance that store audience with with the festival audience because you have different design considerations. Like almost to the point where I'd think that if the store audience is what you're really after, figuring out how to work your ideas into a game friendly context might be another approach. Because there's certainly I'm calling it cultural XR, but it's not to say there's not value in the gaming led approach as well. I mean, you take games like The Last of Us is beautifully written. It looks at human nature and it also looks at its own genre, poking fun at it in very interesting ways. Um, Meaningful piece of work done very much as a commercial gaming product. So it's not to say that ideas can't be moved into that. There are some projects where gaming might be more appropriate than the festival contexts. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
But then, for example, why you think that the store, like the Steam store or the Quest store, have such a hard time surfacing this cultural XR project? Because, I mean, in all transparency, I
yeah,
am I do love to share about these experiences. And
yeah,
when I see like this piece got the award at this festival, I would like to try it. And
yeah.
I just feel like I cannot find it.
Hmm.
I don't know if I cannot find it on the store. I don't know if I cannot find it on the website of the creators. It is just in general so hard to find this cultural XR project. Why is this the case?
A few reasons on that one. Part of the reason why it's hard to find them, and it's something that's really sad. It's only happened very recently, but one of the strongest pieces of cultural XR that I've seen is a piece called "Notes on Blindness." Amazing documentary piece about a man's experience of losing his sight. Um, and amazing piece, but it didn't have the budget to be maintained. It was made a good long time ago, so it's actually just become unavailable to the point where you can't get it on any platforms. Having that budget to maintain it is definitely important for the access. The platforms, you can see why they wouldn't let you load an older version of the OS onto the device, security, etc. But being able to run these devices in some sort of standalone sense would be wonderful. So that you could still look at older stuff because as the tools evolve, the if the software doesn't, it's just abandoned. Another thing though that would be an easier way for the platforms to help surface this work is in a lot of the platforms, you don't even have appropriate metadata categories for this sort of work. Um, like in Steam, you don't really have the right buckets, the right boxes to put this sort of work in to make it findable. That's also a big problem on this. And you can understand why. I mean, like a piece of work that had really good reviews on it might get 10, 20 reviews in Steam, and that's at the high end of cultural works in Steam versus Counter-Strike, 65 million. You know, it's orders of magnitude. It's not even it's a grain of sand on the beach. I mean, why are they going to be making new metadata categories for a grain of sand on the beach. But it's also, on the other hand, is sort of thing that doesn't cost a lot, does it?
So you mentioned about different options, right? For example,
Mm.
this event, LBE, and are there other means of distribution? Like, what are there other alternatives of ways for this team to kind of like share their work that is not just like a curated environment at a physical locations? What are their options?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's interesting because one thing on this with immersive work is there's a lure of the headset, and it's fantastic technology to be working with. Absolutely fantastic technology to be working with. But when you're working with immersive media, stretching your boundaries to think beyond that can sometimes be very rewarding. And the piece that comes to mind for me for that is there's a group called Dark Field Radio. Have you come across their stuff before? It's
No,
um
what do
it's
they do?
beautiful work. It's immersive, done almost entirely through audio and instructions to situate you. So I'd seen quite a few of these under the lockdown and COVID. They're timed entry events, so it works almost like a festival, even though it's online. It's streaming, it only happens at a specific time, and they stage you. So this is to be listened to with a blindfold on, but while you're sitting in a car. So you have to find a car, sit inside of it, put your headphones on, close your eyes, and then enter this immersive audio world is an amazing way of working with it that cuts down on the production costs, certainly, but it's also equally immersive. So thinking about how you can stretch your way past the boundaries of the medium can be very helpful. Now, this is that's an extreme case, but a good one that comes to mind is if you're working with mixed reality. You don't necessarily have to have things be multi-user in your network stack to have multiple people interacting together with headsets on. Each one can be running a standalone app and they can still feel like they're collectively doing something. So thinking about how you can do that kind of stuff cuts off probably half the budget of the project using multi-user networking. That's expensive to do. So being clever about how you find ways to get this stuff to happen can be very useful. You were talking about the event production side of it as well. One thing that can be very interesting with that, it's an old thing. It comes from a lot of things, but if you look at kind of how performance art worked in the 1970s, you would have things like installation instructions that would be almost a guide to put on your own location-based experience of various sorts. The idea of having this be something that can be ad hoc put on by people is very interesting as well, you know?
So this means like having a simple guide or a manual so that this thing can be set up by anybody, let's say very easily, so that anybody could kind of like run those.
Exactly, exactly. Like, and thinking about how do you make this so that it's the least expensive, most impactful um, installation you could do,
And
but figuring out not build an immaculate stage set, but how do you get somebody to build their own on site? Or how do you train up the front of house staff to know the script so that they're part of the audience? A bit that works great in location-based experiences and VR in particular is it happens in every kind of theatrical production. You have your onboarding and your offboarding. When you're going into the theater to go and sit down in the seat, when you're walking out at the end, it's part of the experience as much as anything else. In VR, it's even more so because that's when you're fitted with the headset. That's when the equipment's taken back from you. Making those handshake moments theatrical, making them part of the experience instead of just what you do before it is something that can have a lot of rewards to it, you know?
and so it feels also often that these kind of experiences are done maybe by smaller teams that are very inspired by the technology and
Yeah.
that they want to explore with something that is very niche instead of going mainstream. But this all LBE kind of world, right, can
Mm.
feel pretty expensive in a
Yeah.
way, right? So are there, you brought up some great example that I've never thought of, but are there also ways of managing and transitioning that experience into something that is, let's say, more affordable or simpler, that doesn't scare them that much?
Oh, definitely. One thing that's very good to think about when you're coming up with works like this is to think about tiering the infrastructure costs as you're developing it. So, doing the high level LBE that might have plans for a manufactured set, might have three actors involved, might have a truck that needs to bring the equipment to a venue, might have all the stuff that makes your budget go up, up, up. Um, then can you think about what are two more tiers that go underneath that? Like, what's the version that you can do with 4 swivel chairs? What's the version that you can do with a couple of room dividers? And thinking of what are ways that we can take this expensive build and figure out what's the way we might be able to do it in a community center theater rather than Broadway, if you're using theater as a metaphor. And basically building the physical set and the build your project, thinking of categories you can use to say lessen the cost, make it more deliverable to wider audiences for the same price.
And everything goes back, like all these are things that needs to be taught from step zero.
Yeah,
Basically, like you are at the drawing board, adding post-it about what the story is about, what the setting is about,
yeah.
and having those things in mind from the very beginning. I feel it's the only way, because adapting it afterward, it's not gonna cut it, I think.
Absolutely, and it's a very difficult task to adapt these things in this way. I mean, you can think about it because a big part of what you're doing when you're designing for the location-based, the standalone kind of the new user experience is saying, okay, it's going to take them so long to get used to the gestures and interactions. How much time do we give to teach them what they need to do in a way where there's no stakes to it, so they don't get frustrated later on? These are all kind of first user problems. When you're doing this, you're not designing for the person who's done the experience 10 times already, and then they're frustrated with learning your mechanic again. These sorts of things, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I was also wondering, like if you have encountered, or maybe what are your thoughts on designing instead for what is like long-lived, let's say after festival
Oh yeah.
lifetime, but on the web, or something that could instead be experienced in 2D. So these I feel like two different things, right? In a sense, you can imagine having an experience that could run on a headset, but could also run on the web. It allows
Yeah.
you to basically deploy it much more easily, have it also on a website. So the distribution, it's kind of like different. Maybe we can start with that. Have you seen some successful experiences or something like that that still keeps living on the web?
Yeah. In fact, the space on the website of stuff that I see that I'm happy with for a bunch of ways is actually some of the newer stuff that's come out from the Viverse from HTC. Um, which is their basically web-enabled kind of hybrid system that allows both headset-based access through WebXR, basically, or it allows phone-based access where you have an avatar that you can drive, or laptop-based. For me, there's so many draws and advantages and problematic bits inside of this as well that come in. You have the natural bit is that capabilities wise, you're ratcheted down quite a bit in terms of what you can actually do on these platforms. Um, and you also have the idea of figuring out once you've figured out your interaction scheme for the headset based work, then it's figuring out how does it work on your phone, how does it work with the mouse. Three separate interaction problems on that. But three interesting problems, and if you get those nailed in a way where they work well together, the idea of people being able to casually engage with your work like you would on the phone is interesting. I mean, like the kind of the good and bad thing about XR is it's high impact to get ready to use it. You don't casually say, "Oh yeah, I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to watch that VR piece. Only 2 minutes. I'll be fine," because you've got probably 5 to 10 minutes of setup with the VR. You get the headset on, find out that it's charged, look for the batteries for your controller, get the lights set up, redo your boundaries. Da 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 da. It's 10 minutes later before you're actually in the experience. Um, the hybrid
You
experience
forgot to
is,
mention you forgot to mention the update on the headset as well, by the way.
oh yeah, oh yeah, and
No,
then
that's true. I believe 10 minutes is pretty accurate.
yeah, and then you look through the new UI to find out where your menus move to.
Don't get me
All that,
started
yeah,
on that.
yeah. So the ability to have worlds where you can casually jump in, jump out, particularly the phone based on the Vive, to me is fascinating. But outside of certain gaming contexts, the UI is maybe too gaming focused. Um, on those, but that's something that fun design can solve it. You know, they give you the tools to change that if you like. So this is interesting to me. I like the way that the Viverse side of things has worked along that very nicely. I especially like the way that it's implementing some of the other emerging technologies into that. The way that it's dealing with stuff like splatting, which is which it's got about the most turnkey system for getting it onto somebody else's headset that I can think of. A splat that
And
you've created, which is nice. Or for that matter, sending it to somebody's phone.
so then this is like, and have you seen some examples now of these experiences that, let's say, were born in a festival and they managed to transition on another form, like for example on WebXR or maybe on a, let's say, 2D screens, like on a phone? Uh, because I mean, the idea sounds amazing, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the potential all feels there, but I'm not sure if there have been success stories.
I'd say on that, and on the web side of things, that's relatively new. It's new to the point where I don't think that the ability to do that easily has even gone through a full cycle. You've certainly seen, though, in the festival environment, in particular with the Venice Immersive Festival, has done a lot of work through, I believe it's Michael Salmon, has done a lot of work engaging with the creator community um, through AltSpace VR.
So if let's say
and and
uh
and this has started to build in a weird way the opposite. It's building people who are making the worlds otherwise and bringing them into the festival environment.
can you make an example just so that we understand
Absolutely.
how this?
Absolutely. Sort of rather than engaging with the more traditional kind of art practice based work, um, that's made by studios that are effectively working as studios that this is what they do. The Venice Immersive Festival is also engaged with the creator communities that exist inside of the VR ecosystem. So people that are making almost as point of pride immersive environments, these sort of things. Works that are maybe less narratively suited to a festival, but that show a new way of working with media that's interesting. These sorts of works have been brought in, and those tend to be created with more of a portability aspect to them in mind, because they're also being used almost to show off to the community. So it's number of eyes on the world is important to the creators.
And so Michael, I wanted to kind of like close up a bit based on your research and your experience and
Sure.
what you've seen. If you were going to start a new, let's say, cultural XR project today,
Yeah.
how would you kind of like approach it? Maybe like from the funding, from the distribution, based on what you have learned and what you think is kind of like working now.
Yeah. It's a good question. What I would base it around is I would base it around a flexible and low cost, but situational project. So something that's location based in some way, whether that's through museum tours, whether it's through sending it to cultural events, institutions, whether it's through schools. I would think about this long tail past the festival of repeated reads, and I would make my design decisions primarily around those, with the festival as the hurdle to get past, rather than designing perfectly for the festival and ending up with a piece that needs to be redesigned to ship it. Because then you're in a position where you do well at the festival and people look at it and say, "Ooh, I like it, but it's very impractical," which gets in the way of bringing the piece to the festival to begin with in a lot of ways.
And do you think would that also facilitate with the funding? Like, because maybe the funding are like technological improvement, advancement, those are being
Yeah,
also some of the parameters that are, let's say, looked at when
yeah,
evaluating if a project gets funded. And when you go for something that is instead maybe more approachable, but has indeed a more long-term
yeah.
strategy around it, do you think that that view might also affect the chances of being funded?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's two major motivators for giving you funding, right? Money and impact. Um, People that are kind of putting funds out from governmental initiatives, nonprofits, etc., they're seeding an ecosystem. So they're after impact narratives. People who are in it as more traditional investments, they're in it for a return on their investment. In either way, having a solid model for how you're going to get eyes on your work and people paying for eyes on your work after its initial premiere, after the narrative is done, after the experience is quote unquote done, then it moves on. If you've got a model to do that, that can't hurt. That can't hurt funders from either perspective. Gives them something to critique if the motivations are financial, and it gives them a mechanism to reassure that impact is going to be maintained past an initial moment of premiere.
Yeah, so probably that's going to be, let's say, more of a strength in a way, seen as like we are keeping it simple because we want to deploy it after. We want to have a broader impact, not just a one-time show during the festival.
Yeah, and as far as that's going as well, I would also in that starting the cultural project, because the start is when you can clear out a lot of the bad habits of a project. You can prevent a lot of the bad habits that grow into projects by really starting to define things at the start. A few of the things that I would consider towards the start of a cultural XR project would be that distribution model is definitely important. I would also, from a technical perspective, I would want to look at stuff at dependencies. You'd want to look very closely at any hard external dependencies, cloud services, etc., that your piece might rely on. The technological landscape right now is shifting very, very rapidly. Give a point in case, there's been a few pieces over the years that I've worked on that have integrated Ready Player Me as a core technology. That was a very successful cloud-based alternative to a homemade avatar system. That was great because you're like, oh, great, don't have to roll this myself. This is wonderful. The problem is it was pulled with very short notice and left a lot of projects hanging from that side. So I think that one thing to think about when you're creating cultural XR is having a fallback plan for any hard technological dependency. This might mean, like, whenever possible, use the generic kind of universal XR libraries rather than Pico specific, meta specific. Gives you a lot more flexibility to port it. Like that's an interesting question, actually. I'd say that the two biggest standalone headsets that you get these days are going to be Meta or Pico, right? Pretty much.
Fair. I mean, sometimes so for LB, there is still HTC going around,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
But I would say those are the three.
Yeah. I mean, the Meta and Pico problem becomes challenging if you're planning international deliveries between China and the US, respectively. Pico is not commercially available in the US, and while there's no restrictions on deploying it, if you've got it on tour and your backup unit has to get shipped from across the world, this is a problem. And with Meta, if you're planning releases in China, this becomes a problem because of the infrastructure's need to talk to Facebook, Meta, Oculus, whatever they call themselves these days. Yeah,
It keeps changing, so don't worry.
Yeah. So designing with the more generic kind of platform tools in mind, that can be really helpful to allow you to do a less severe pivot if these opportunities open up later on. So these are all kind of like interesting first stage questions that you wouldn't think would necessarily kind of be related, but it's sort of like if you're thinking, okay, we want to do this as an LBE, depending on what your plan for that is, that's really going to impact the actual hardware you use, the software libraries you use.
Michael, thank you very much. I think people have, let's say, got a good thought and let's say have a good perspective of how these things change and evolves. I've also learned a lot. So I wanted to thank you very much for your contribution. And I'm sure that people can, let's say, have a deeper dive into this topic by following you. The links are certainly in the episode description. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for listening in. If you like the show, remember to leave a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or a thumbs up on YouTube. It really helps me keep doing this and shine the spotlights on the greatest founders and makers, pushing the boundaries of XR and AI. Also, make sure to check out the show page xraispotlight.com, where you can find more conversation like this one. Till next time.